Audio Lecture Unit 6, Islam and the Arab World. First, let's talk about the origins of the religion Islam. As we've stated before, there are three Abrahamic faiths. They all stem, of course, from the original Abrahamic faith, which is Judaism. Modern-day Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all stem from Abraham, who's seen as the father of all of those religions. The Jews and the Christians trace their lineage back through Abraham's son Isaac, his official son, his son from his wife, and the Muslims, or those who follow Islam, trace their lineage back to the son of Abraham, Ishmael, who was his illegitimate son with his servant girl Hagar. All right, so during the classical age, all the world's religions emerged or evolved, except for Islam. It came about a little after the classical age. By the 600s, the political disunity in the Middle East allowed a final major religion, Islam, to emerge. So this is the area we're talking about here, and specifically we're focusing at first the birth of Islam on the Arabian Peninsula. This area right here you see in the green. Islam began among a group of people called the Bedouins. Now, the Bedouins were nomads who controlled caravan routes across the Arabian desert. Camels, as you recall from earlier lectures about trade routes, were very good at traveling across the desert because their feet were large and they had a kind of wide spread to them that allowed them to not sink in the sand. They could also haul a great deal of weight, as well as they did not need as much water as some other pack animals did. So these Bedouin nomads ultimately were I guess you would say the beginning, the first group of people to commit to this religion, this new religion. Even though Islam traces its roots back to Abraham, which is roughly, 1800 BC, officially Islam does not begin as a religion until we get into the 600s AD. This is the area right here of the trade routes, the caravan trade routes you see in black, whereas the Silk Road you see in red, and the sea route, which is part of the Indian Ocean trade route that we've talked about before, is seen in green. So the Arabian Peninsula was crossroads for trade between the Eastern world and the Western world. Arabian cities like Mecca and Yathrib, which eventually is known as Medina, were both trade centers for these caravans. They were caravan towns where trade popped up. They were way stations, if you will. They were watering stations for the camels. They became crossroads for trade. Mecca was already seen as a religious center even before the rise of Islam. Pilgrims, religious pilgrims, were focusing on the polytheistic gods of the region, of the old, I guess you would say Mesopotamian gods, as well as others that have been introduced in the area through the centuries. They always came to Mecca to visit a polytheistic temple that housed a stone called the Kaaba. Now, this stone eventually is seen by the Muslims, or the practitioners of Islam, as a meteorite that was given to Abraham from God, from Yahweh, from Allah, as they will call him. And ultimately, that becomes this, what used to be a polytheistic temple, eventually becomes a center pilgrimage place for Islam as well. It's converted, if you will, from that polytheistic temple into a Muslim mosque. Trade brought both Jews and Christians into Saudi Arabia, or what was then called the Arabian Peninsula, and two cities like Mecca that were crossroads for those trade routes. And this will influence the development of Islam. Obviously, since they all stem from Abraham, those Jewish and Christian traders will influence these Bedouin traders. And that convinces a lot of these Bedouin traders that their roots lie with Abraham as well, with Abraham's son Ishmael, who was sent back to the Arabian Peninsula after the birth of Isaac. In the 620s AD, Islam was officially founded by a man named Muhammad. Now, Muhammad had been the head of a caravan trade network. Ultimately, caravan manager is what they were called. He had inherited this business from his master. His master he had been apprenticed with. Once his master died, that business was left to him. He married his master's widow and ultimately became a very influential man in Meccan society. One day he was meditating in the desert regions, and he thought that he heard the voice of the angel Gabriel speaking to him to leave the materialistic and polytheistic ways of Mecca and instead follow Allah, which is the Arabic word for God, as the one true God. The roots, of course, with Abraham will be outlined, of course, from Gabriel to Muhammad later. Here is Gabriel right here. And so, as I said, Muslims believe the Archangel Gabriel visited Muhammad in this cave on Mount Hira and taught him eventually to recite the revelations from God or from Allah. Now, ultimately, he will go back many times to meditate, and when he comes back is when he has these recitations, if you will. These revelations were given to him, and he recites them eventually to his followers, and his followers will eventually write them down. And those recitations of Muhammad that are seen to be divine inspiration from Allah will be written down into the holy book for the Muslims called the Quran, which we'll talk more about on a later slide. Muhammad taught the new religion in Mecca, and his followers became known as Muslims. So it's important that you remember that the religion itself is called Islam, but the followers are called Muslims. They're not called Islams. They're called Muslims. Mecca's leaders ultimately became more and more concerned over the popularity of Muhammad and his preaching of this, what he referred to as the one true faith. They worried that this would ultimately diminish their power structure that they had there in Mecca. They feared that Muhammad's monotheistic religion might end the profitable pilgrimages to their city by the polytheistic people to come and visit the Kaaba and other things. So eventually they wanted to get rid of him. The city leadership in Mecca ran Muhammad and his followers out of town. This happens, this flight away from Mecca, and the flight ultimately leads Muhammad and his followers to Medina or Yathrib. It happens in 622 AD. So this is known as the Hijra, which basically means the flight from Mecca to Medina. Muhammad left Mecca, moved to Yathrib or Medina in this Hijra, this journey, if you will. And people in Medina or Yathrib embraced Islam. He ultimately was able to take over the city himself, create a theocracy based on, the religion being in charge of the government, and the city would be renamed Medina, which basically means city of the prophet. Muhammad is not seen as divine by the Muslims. He is seen as the prophet of Allah. He's also referenced in the Quran as the last prophet of God. They recognize earlier prophets that came from Judaism and from Christianity even as prophets, but the final prophet, where the final truths of God, they say, or Allah, were revealed to Muhammad. Again, this is what they believe. So there you go, Mecca moving northward to Yathrib, that will be renamed Medina, or City of the Prophet. In 630, Muhammad and his followers, just 8 short years after the Hijrah, will be able to return to the city of Mecca. And ultimately, they kind of invade the city, and the city surrenders to them. By this point, Muhammad had gained so much popularity with this religion that the Bedouin traders outnumbered, those that supported the staying in the polytheistic ways. And so he returns from Medina to Mecca, and the city surrenders to him. The polytheistic idols in the house of the Kaaba would be destroyed, but the meteorite remained. Again, Muhammad and his followers believed that this meteorite was actually given to Abraham from Allah, and that Abraham then gave that to his son Ishmael before sending him back to Mesopotamia when Isaac was born. So again, you can see the roots of all three of the world's major monotheistic religions come from Abraham. That's why we refer to them as Abrahamic faiths. By 640, Muhammad had died. He actually died in 632, shortly after his return to Medina. But by 640, the religion had spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And you see all of the areas in red became known as conquests of the Islamic people. So Islam ultimately will take over the majority of the Arabian Peninsula. Let's talk a little bit more about the specific Islamic beliefs. We'll see in these beliefs some similarities to Judaism and Christianity, as well as some deviations from them. Since they all have the same roots with Abraham, it's understandable that they will have some similarities. But of course, we also know some very, very big differences as well. Islam incorporates many of the Judeo-Christian traditions. All of these religions, these three religions, worship one true God. The Jews refer to him as Yahweh or Jehovah or God. The Christians refer to him as God the Father. And the Muslims refer to him as Allah. But the Muslims consider Muhammad, as I said before, the final prophet that God spoke to. The Quran, as I mentioned before, contains Muhammad's teachings. It's written in an Arabic dialect called Fusha that is now shared by all Muslims. If you are to be a good Muslim, you need to learn how to read Arabic in this dialect in order for you to read the Quran properly in the proper translation. The fundamental beliefs of Islam are expressed in the 5 pillars of the faith. These are duties for all Muslims, representing the submission to the will of Allah. We'll go over all of these as we go through the next few slides. Okay, the declaration of the faith, first of all, is the first pillar. This first pillar teaches that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his final prophet or his messenger. Muslims must recite this declaration of faith as a true Muslim. So that's the first pillar, declaration of faith. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That is the recitation. Basically, here is another translation of it. I bear witness that there is no God except Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. The second pillar of Islam is demands prayer 5 times each day at particular times of the day. We call it obligatory prayer. Obligatory meaning you are obliged to, or it is an obligation to do so. 5 times a day, facing towards Mecca. No matter where you are in the world, you would have to orient yourself to bow in the direction of Mecca. There is an app actually now for the 5 times of day, and you see what they're named there. There's actually an extra one, a sixth one in the middle there that is not one of the original 5. But there you go. There are the 5 times of day that you are supposed to pray. The third pillar commands charity to the poor, compulsory giving to the poor. This third pillar commands that charity should be given through a special tax. Okay, this tax is about 2.5% of your annual income that needs to be given to the theocracy, the state, which is controlled by the religion. And it is done to take care of the less fortunate Muslims living in that Islamic state. The fourth pillar commands fasting for 1 month a year during the holy month for Muslims known as Ramadan. During Ramadan, Muslims cannot eat or drink anything while the sun is up. So when the sun rises, every day that month, they have to stop eating or drinking. When the sun goes down, they can eat or drink again. This is sometimes difficult to follow because they live in the desert. Not everybody, of course, now that is a Muslim lives in the desert, but the original Muslims did. So it was a difficult thing, the idea to feel closer to Allah. And of course, the fifth pillar commands that all Muslims should, if they are financially able, make at least one pilgrimage to Mecca 1 time in their life. This pilgrimage to Mecca is known as the Hajj, and this is a massive pilgrimage that happens every year at around the same time. You can see here at the Great Mosque in Mecca, which houses that Kaaba, that original meteorite, and you can see the thousands and thousands of faithful that walk around this repeatedly, and it's even blurred in the picture because the movement was happening as the picture was taken. Okay, the Muslims also refer to the entire population of Muslim believers throughout the world as the Ummah. The Ummah are basically the faithful, the Islamic faithful. The Ummah today, you see, we have a lot of them in North Africa, a lot of them throughout the Middle East, the original birthplace of Islam, of course, in Saudi Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula, and also in Central Asia. Southeast Asia also has a heavy population of Ummah. There are about 1.62 billion followers of Islam worldwide. The Ummah includes 22% ultimately of the human population. It is the second largest religion in the world, second only to, of course, Christianity. Muslims also had other rules that they lived by. They had the 5 original pillars of the faith, which are the basis of their doctrine, if you will. But then they also had other cultural practices and traditions. Some of the cultural practices were known as hadiths. So they formed these hadiths, and eventually they also formed formal laws called Sharia laws that were put in place in these theocratic governments. The governments are controlled by the religion, okay, guiding the behavior, the family life, the business transactions, and the entire community. The hadiths and the Sharia laws ultimately are the rules by which Muslims are required to live. Jihad originally referred to the struggle to live a righteous life, an internal struggle within each person, each Muslim every day as they wake up, making the decision to follow the rules of Allah and live a good life. This is, of course, a similar thing that we saw with the Jewish tradition of, ethical monotheism. That is the choice that the that the Jew makes every day to live a righteous life according to the Ten Commandments. And of course, we know that the Christians also take that from Judaism, since Jesus was a Jew originally. So jihad originally referred to that same kind of concept of an ethical quality to this monotheistic religion. Struggle to live a righteous life, struggle against evil, struggle against whatever, badness or whatever. But jihad eventually will come to mean something quite different. The outward struggle to against anybody who is outside of the Muslim faith, those that they consider the quote infidel. Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, is patriarchal in its social structure. Although women could engage in business, they could inherit property, and they could get a divorce, it's still a very patriarchal religion. Men and women were considered equal in the eyes of Allah, but social and sexual lives of women on earth were strictly controlled. And this was done ultimately to ensure that heirs in families were legitimate. An excerpt from the Quran says, "Those who surrender themselves to Allah and accept the true faith, who are devout, sincere, patient, humble, charitable, and chaste, who fast and are mindful of Allah, on these both men and women, Allah will bestow forgiveness and rich reward." Muslim men were allowed up to 4 wives, like Muhammad had. He had 4, so that's why the number 4. But women were only allowed to have 1 husband. Now, a lot of people wonder why this is, and a lot of it had to do with the cultural norms that were already practiced in the Arabian Peninsula before even the rise of Islam. You see, in that environment, especially with warfare that swept through the area between the different tribes that were living there, these Bedouin tribes. Ultimately, there were more women than there were men, and they needed to take care of those women. So men would take on more than 1 wife oftentimes in order to take care of those who had been widowed by their husband being killed in war or what have you. Muslims eventually adopted a lot of the Mesopotamian customs of making women wear veils in public. Now, this was an old Mesopotamian custom. Remember, though, that Mesopotamia is located in the Arabian Peninsula. So this tradition goes back farther back than the religion of Islam itself. There are some different kinds of veils. There's, of course, the hijab, which shows the face. There's the khador, which only shows the eyes. And then there's the burqa, which covers the entire body. The Quran says, "And say to the believing woman that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty and ornaments." Islamic houses of worship were called mosques, as I mentioned before. The Sabbath, or holy day, where they observed worship to Allah, would be observed on Fridays, much like we saw in the Jewish faith, the original Sabbath day, again, tracing back to Abraham and his traditions. It is thought that Abraham probably taught the worship of of Yahweh, of course, the Jewish name for God the Father, to his son Ishmael before sending him back to Mesopotamia. And so, therefore, that's why the Muslims trace their lineage back to Ishmael, who settled in this region, and observed the Sabbath on Friday as Ishmael and his successors would have done. Mosques are often identifiable by the minarets that you see sticking up. They are towers where the muezzin call the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. There's 5 mandatory times a day. And the muezzin basically are they like chant. They're criers, if you will, that call the faithful to pray at the specific times of day they're supposed to. Now let's talk a little bit about the Muslim split, because this will make a huge difference in politics going forward in this region of the world. Muhammad was seen, as I said, by the Muslims as the final prophet of Allah. No one could serve the same role as leader of Islam to Muhammad. So when he dies, there's a bit of a crisis on who would inherit the mantle of being, the head of the Islamic faith. Since Muhammad was the final prophet, it couldn't be somebody else considered a prophet. So it's going to have to be something else. This is where the split happens. Leaders of the Ummah established a form of government called a caliphate, led by a caliph. A caliph is a successor to Muhammad. But who were these caliphs? Well, who was the original caliph is basically the bone of contention around which the split in the Muslim faith happens. The first four, what they are called rightly guided caliphs, included Muhammad's father-in-law and son-in-law. Abu Bakr, the truthful, as his name, was Muhammad's father-in-law. Umar was the distinguisher of right and wrong, who was Muhammad's buddy. He would be murdered later. Most all of these would be assassinated or murdered in some way. There's Uthman, the generous, who was Muhammad's son-in-law twice, that I saw before, meaning he married two of Muhammad's daughters. And he would be murdered. And the last one of the four rightly guided caliphs was Ali, the commander of the faithful. He was Muhammad's cousin and another one of his son-in-laws. Okay, so these are the four rightly guided caliphs, as they're referred to. They were seen to have a direct lineage to Muhammad, a direct family relationship to Muhammad. But they faced assassination by rival clans that believed that they had leaders who should lead the faithful instead of these caliphs, and thus the split in the Muslim faith. Sunnis were called followers of tradition. They believed the caliphs should be chosen by the Muslim leaders, that they did not necessarily have to be of the same family line as Muhammad, but they should be chosen by the Muslim leaders throughout the Muslim world, and ultimately it had a kind of democratic feel to it, although it's not really democracy, but it had a kind of democratic feel to it, that it should be a consensus, if you will, of the Muslim leaders of congregations in these Muslim territories who would be the caliph. So they were called the Sunnis. The Shia are known as partisans of Ali. They thought the caliphs should be related to Muhammad, that they should have a direct family relationship to Muhammad. And so ultimately the Shia will be a smaller group because, of course, Muhammad's family line will eventually, die off and become smaller and smaller. So the Sunni make up the majority of the population of Muslims, and the Shia make up a smaller but influential minority of Muslims. The Sunni and Shia split, as it's called, has caused political division and conflict throughout the Muslim world to this very day. And if you look, everything in lighter green is part of the Sunni tradition, and everything in darker green is part of the Shia tradition. Typically, the Shia are seen as the more militant of the groups of Muslims, and the Sunni are seen as the more accepting of Western ideas. Not that they are completely open to Western ideas, but the Shia are really, really reactionary conservative in this modern day, more so than the Sunni. Later, there's another group called the Sufi. The Sufi are basically mystics among the Muslim population. Some of them are Sunni, some of them are Shia. Most of them are probably Shia because they're more conservative, if you will. But the Sufi eventually emerged, and they rejected the materialism of the caliphs, especially the Sunni caliphs. And they embraced some of the traditions that they found in other religions, like Christian and Buddhist traditions of poverty, meditation, and chanting. The Sufi eventually give way to groups of people like the whirling dervishes. Sufi meditation involves whirling, that's why the whirling dervish, and represents the revolving of the planets around the sun. Now let's talk about these caliphates that are established. Basically, a caliphate is a Muslim kingdom. By 661, the Umayyad family, which were practitioners in the Sufi branch of Islam, took control under a new caliph called Muawiyah. Okay, Muawiyah ultimately will be the founder of a dynasty, if you will, the Umayyad dynasty. And eventually they will come to control huge portions of the Arabian Peninsula and even beyond. The spread of Islam happens, it begins. The spread outside of the Arabian Peninsula begins with the Umayyad dynasty. The capital city will be at Damascus, you see there notated on the map. The Muawiyah moved the capital to Damascus in Syria from Mecca. Now, Mecca will still be seen as the religious capital of the Islamic world, but this will be the political capital of the Umayyad Caliphate or the Umayyad dynasty. It was a wealthy area. It was centrally located on trade routes, but it was among non-Arabs as well. Non-Arabs traveled through this area a great deal as well. So non-Arab Muslims are what we're going to start seeing as Islam spreads outside of the Arabian Peninsula. The Umayyads grew very wealthy. The Umayyad dynasty, the caliphs, if you will, the kings in the Umayyad dynasty, grew very wealthy because of trade coming through the region, and they also were very powerful. This would, of course, anger the Shia Muslims who preferred Muhammad's simple lifestyle and who traced their lineage directly back to Muhammad through his family line. Muawiyah's successors conquered Afghanistan, spreading the Umayyad dynasty outside of the Arabian Peninsula. This part was more eastern, and then they moved also into northern Africa, and even eventually spreading all the way up into Europe, into what would have been at that point in time Christian Spain. This, of course, had been part of the older Western Roman Empire, but by the time we get to the 700s, it is a new kingdom established by the Visigoths, one of those groups of people that came and infiltrated the Western Roman Empire as it fell. The spread of Islam is part of the external jihad struggle. And as you look at this map here, it's a moving map showing you the years and how quickly Islam will spread. It eventually spreads outside of the Arabian Peninsula, taking over portions of the Middle East, then moving into northern Africa, moving further eastward into the areas that had been part of Persia, northern Africa, all the way pushing up eventually into Spain. The spread of Islam will eventually be halted as the Spanish Muslims, known as Moors, will eventually fight a war with the Franks, who had come to settle in France, which used to be called Gaul. And the advance of the Muslim world in Europe, anyways, will be halted by the Franks. We'll talk more specifically about that in a later unit. Arab Muslims served in government, paid only the special tax, and were encouraged not to marry non-Arabs during the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyad dynasty, in other words, were very much they gave preferential treatment to the Arab Muslims. Yes, they were conquering other territories that were outside of Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, so they were forcing others to convert to Islam, but they did not give them equal citizenship. Ultimately, they gave preference to the Arab Muslims over the non-Arab Muslims. The non-Arabs were known as Mawali. This is a quote from Muhammad that would ultimately discredit that idea. So it's interesting that the Umayyad Caliphate fostered this idea of, exclusivity, because Muhammad says in the Quran, all mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim. So even though that was in the Quran, that was not actually embraced by the Umayyad kings or the Umayyad caliphs. Mawali, those non-Arab Muslims, as the Umayyad dynasty spread, had to pay heavier taxes than the Arab ones, and they were considered outside of the Ummah, even though many of them will convert to Islam over time. So they were kind of second-class citizens in the Umayyad dynasty. Now, we also have a concept known as people of the book. The Islamic believers, the Muslim believers, see Judaism and Christianity as having the same roots as Islam through Abraham. And they refer to Christians and Jews as people of the book because of that. And in the Umayyad dynasty, oddly enough, the people of the book, Christians and Jews that were doing trade and may have actually even lived in those areas that they were conquering, were treated actually much better than the Mawali. Muslims respected the shared beliefs and roots of the Jews and the Christians, and they liked doing trade with them as well. Now, not all of the Muslims in the Muslim world under the Umayyad Caliphate saw things this way, but this was, I guess you would say, the practice of the government under the Umayyad Caliphate. They, like I said, all saw their roots back to Abraham and Moses as well. And even Jesus was considered a prophet to the Muslims as well. He was not considered the Messiah or the Son of God. In fact, the Muslims don't recognize a need for a Messiah because they believe that Allah himself is all that is necessary. And of course, Muhammad being the prophet, the final prophet of Allah as far as they're concerned. Now you might notice this picture of Muhammad with his face blacked out. That became a tradition among the Muslim population to try to keep from idol worship. They did not want Muhammad being put on a pedestal, seen as perhaps a deity himself, because he wasn't. This was strict monotheism. Remember, the first pillar of the faith is there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. So they wanted to make sure that Muhammad was not recognized as immortal, so they always blacked out his face so it wouldn't seem like idol worship. In 750 AD, the exclusion of the Mawali ultimately will lead to rebellions throughout the Umayyad dynasty. Those Mawali had desire for religious equality, and the Umayyad dynasty would eventually be overthrown. The Umayyad Caliphate, you see here, will eventually shrink, and we have the beginning of a new caliphate called the Abbasid Caliphate. Smaller, but very powerful. So let's talk a little bit about the Abbasid Caliphate, the next big dynasty. In 750, Abu Abbas, who was a distant relative of Muhammad, so a Shia Muslim, ultimately overthrew the Umayyads, the Sunni Muslims, and established the new Abbasid Caliphate, or kingdom. The Abbasids considered all Muslims equal, though. Even though they were Shia, the Abbasid dynasty developed the practice of treating all Muslims equally. And this ultimately kind of democratized the religion and led to the further expansion and strengthening of the Abbasid Caliphate or dynasty. The government was led by what was called a vizier. The vizier was directed by the caliph. Now, so the caliph was kind of the head honcho, and the vizier would be kind of like his vice king. So vizier was seen as the assistant or the second in command to the caliph, and ultimately doled out responsibilities to other bureaucrats underneath him. Probably the most famous vizier that I can think of, from Disney, of course, as I can always bring things back to Disney, would be Jafar in Aladdin. Jafar was the vizier to the sultan. That was just the name, another name for a caliph, another name for a king in that part of the world. All right, so directed by the caliph, the vizier was sort of like the vice king. And then, of course, under him would be a state council. And each province that the Abbasid dynasty controlled was led by an emir. The emirs were in charge of collecting the taxes in that region and keeping the peace, making sure that the taxes got back up to the caliph and that the peace was kept so the empire could continue to strengthen and continue to grow financially, economically, what have you. The Arabic language ultimately would be a unifying force in the caliphate. Muslims must know Arabic in order to read the Quran. So even though non-Arab peoples were now part of the Arab world, if you will, as they conquered territories outside of the Arabian Peninsula, those non-Arabic Muslims learned to speak and read Arabic so they could read the Quran. And ultimately, that is a unifying force. It's both a spoken language and a written language. And by enforcing this, the Abbasid dynasty or caliphate will create a sense of unity among the people. Trade will flourish. As a result of this, it could be the Arabic could also be used as the language of business, and it connected the far-flung parts of the Abbasid dynasty or caliphate. The Abbasids prospered by doing this. And they also played a key role in those trade networks that connected the East, including the areas of the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean Trade Network, to the West, including those old Roman roads that now had been inherited by the new kingdoms that had been established in Western Europe after the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire. The Abbasids also did a lot of trade with the Byzantine Empire, or the eastern half of the Roman Empire, that did not fall as well. The Abbasids moved their capital from Damascus, where the Umayyads had it, to Baghdad. Baghdad was a diverse city that served as a center of trade and culture throughout the entire Abbasid dynasty. Baghdad, of course, in modern-day Iraq. Here is a aerial view of Baghdad between 150 and 300 AD, which basically shows how it was already that early on a crossroads for trade. Of course, by the time we get to the 700s and 800s, even more so. Khatib Baghdadi, around 1000 AD, wrote about Baghdad. There is no city in the world like Baghdad, and in the abundance of its riches, the importance of its business, the number of its scholars and important people, the distinctions of its leaders and its common people, the extent of its palaces, inhabitants, streets, avenues, alleys, mosques, baths, docks, and caravansaries, the purity of the air, the sweetness of the water, the freshness of the dew and its shade, the temperateness of its summer and winter, the healthfulness of its spring and fall, and its great swarming crowds. It's pretty, nice words to say about this bustling city. The point of view of this document, obviously, is very pro-Abbasid dynasty and pro-Baghdad. Islamic civilization will experience a golden age during the Abbasid dynasty. Now remember, the word golden age, or the phrase golden age, basically means that prosperity, economically, helps lead to cultural and intellectual diversity and innovation. Okay? So the wealth leads to cultural and intellectual developments. One follows the other. One begats the other. That's what makes a golden age possible. So, Islamic philosophy under Ibn Rushdi, also known as Ibn Averroes, argued that religion was for the uneducated masses, while philosophy was truth. Theory of the double truth. Can you be religious and philosophical at the same time? Ibn Rushdi tried to see if that could be justified, but stating that philosophy was higher level thinking than just basic faith. What's interesting is this is similar to what Plato had said about, the understanding things on a higher realm, the world of ideas, being different than basic understanding of regular people who take in information from their senses and apply reason to it. So you can see that Ibn Rushdi was very much influenced by the Greek world and by Greek philosophy that had been spread throughout the world through Hellenization. And now that those parts of the world had become part of the greater Arab world under the Abbasid dynasty, you had that cultural diffusion mixing in with the traditions of the Islamic world as well. Again, more cultural diffusion. Poetry and storytelling will thrive during this Arabic Golden Age, during the Abbasid dynasty. Probably one of the most famous, I guess you would say, stories, but it's more than one story. It's 1,000 stories. The 1,001 Nights included stories of Aladdin, which of course I mentioned before, and also Sinbad. And also the tale of Open Sesame is part of the 1,001 Nights. The preface behind 1,001 Nights is Scheherazade, who was one of the wives of the Sultan, was threatened by her new husband that if she did not keep him entertained in one way or another, that he would have her killed. And so on their wedding night, she started to tell him a story. He was intrigued by the story, so he said, okay, I'll let you live one more day. And the next night he said, okay, what do you do to entertain me tonight? She told him another story, and another, and another, and another, for 1,001 nights. By the end of that 1,001 nights and those 1,001 stories that she told, Aladdin was one of them, as I said. Ultimately, she was spared because the Sultan by that point had fallen deeply in love with her and her cleverness. The caliphs established universities as well during this golden age in the Abbasid dynasty. The universities, the Islamic universities, were called madrasas. And these universities translated and preserved works of the ancient Greeks that they came into contact with, as well as ancient Indians. So again, this is where you see even more cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion with the West taking on the Greco-Roman ideals and philosophy, and then with the East taking on the Indian ideas of mathematics and philosophy, medicine, and etc. This is why they adopt the Indian numerals that we talked about in an earlier unit, and we eventually call them Arabic numerals because we, the West, gets them from the Arab world, even though the Arabs adopted them from the Indians. Muslim art also flourished during this time. Depiction of holy figures, like I was saying before, is not permitted. They worry about idolatry. So instead, Muslim art included intricate geometric patterns called arabesques, as well as calligraphy. When it comes to architecture, mosques with beautiful courtyards and minarets, those towers where the muezzin or the holy men call the faithful to prayer the 5 times a day, were built all over the Islamic world. So their temples are more like open courtyards. Now, as I said before, Arabic numerals, which we know are not really Arabic, okay, were built on the mathematical knowledge of the ancient Hindus, the ancient Indians. They are still in use today, leading to the development of algebra or algebra. The compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing is the name of the first algebra textbook, if you will, utilizing new ideas that the Arab world came up with and combining it with the Indian numerical system with the base of 10, 10 digits with 0 through 9 being the digits. Despite the wealth of the Abbasids, the size of the caliphate and religious division led to its decay eventually. All good things, I guess you would say, must come to an end. So, by 1055, I know that's still a big jump from where we have been in the classical period, but by 1055, the Seljuk Turks, which were nomads from the Asian steppe region or wilderness region, eventually come in and conquer Baghdad. They, however, do absorb a lot of the Abbasid culture, they convert to Islam, and they come to control state affairs. So the Turks become the new leaders in the Islamic world instead of the traditional Arabs. In 1258, the Mongols will actually move in and capture Baghdad and execute the last official Abbasid caliph, even though those Turks, those Seljuk Turks, had already taken over most of the Abbasid territory. We'll talk more about the Mongols and the Seljuk Turks in a later unit as well.